Well, welcome everybody. We're so happy that you're here. My name is Sister Ann Catherine. I'm principal of St. Cecilia Academy. And on behalf of the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia and all of us on the Dominican campus, we welcome you, particularly if this is your first time to be with us. In case you don't know much about our school, the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia came to Nashville in 1860 to found a Catholic school for young women, where Christ would be known and loved in the context of a robust Catholic college preparatory intellectual formation. We're very pleased to partner with the Trinity Forum this evening in what promises to be a lively conversation, Faithful Living in Troubled Times, Christians and the Benedict Option. Judging from tonight's turnout, I think this is a topic of great interest to everyone in this room. Just as Rod Dreher mentions in the introduction to his book, our culture is changing rapidly before our very eyes. The eternal verities we took for granted in a former age, concepts of objective truth, human nature, and virtue, for example, are no longer givens in our culture. Yet, working with young people day in and day out, I personally have great confidence that there remains a persistent hunger in every human soul to know what is true and good, and that our vocations as Christians to offer the hope of the gospel is more imperative than ever. Before I introduce Cherie, I want to quote another Benedict who took his name from the great father of Western monasticism. In an address he gave more than 10 years ago, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI said about his namesake, Benedict pointed out to his followers the search for God as the fundamental and indeed the one and only aim of life. He knew, however, that when the believer enters into a profound relationship with God, he cannot be content with a mediocre life under the banner of a minimalistic ethic and a superficial religiosity. In this light, one can better understand the expression that Benedict borrowed from St. Cyprian and summed up in his monk's program of life. Prefer nothing to the love of Christ. Holiness consists of this, a sound proposal for every Christian that has become a real and urgent pastoral need in our time. So, tonight, as we consider practical solutions for living as Christians in an increasingly secular age, ultimately, I think the most important and practical task of everyone in this room is to respond to the Lord's call to holiness. A special thanks to Mr. Byron Smith, to whom we credit the original inspiration for this panel discussion, as well as to Deb Fay and Bridget Thomas at St. Cecilia, who worked with Alyssa Abraham to organize the details of tonight's event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you the president of the Trinity Forum and the facilitator for tonight's evening conversation, Cherie Harder.
Well, many thanks, Sister Ann Catherine. I would just like to add my own welcome to hers to all of you for tonight's evening conversation on faithful living in troubled times, Christians and the Benedict Option. We at the Trinity Forum are really delighted and excited to get to partner with St. Cecilia in hosting tonight's event. We have long been both friends with and fans of both the people and the work of St. Cecilia. And so it's really a pleasure to be able to do this inaugural partnership, and we just thank you for your hospitality. It's really been a delight to work with you all. Sister Ann Catherine also mentioned someone who really cannot be thanked enough tonight, and that is Byron Smith, a friend of St. Cecilia's, and I am very proud to say a trustee of the Trinity Forum. It was really his vision, imagination, and energy that helped make this possible. So Byron, we are indebted. Thank you very much. We're also pleased that each and every one of you are here this evening. As you can tell, it is a full house. We sold out very quickly. If you are one of the poor souls left standing in the back, fear not. There are 3 seats, actually 4 seats, right here on the front row. Don't be shy. come on down. But if you had friends who wanted to be here tonight but could not make it, were shut out because of our sold out status, this we'll be videotaping this. It'll be on our website. St. Cecilia will be sharing it as well on their website. Plenty of photos will be put up on Facebook, the Trinity Forum's Facebook site. So feel free to check that out, tag your friends, and share the video with others who would have liked to have been here but couldn't make it. I'm confident that many of you are familiar with the good work of St. Cecilia's, but for those of you who are new to the work of the Trinity Forum, we seek to provide a space and resources to essentially connect leaders, thinking leaders, with leading thinkers in discussing the great questions of life in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and letters that explore the great enduring questions of life and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as programs such as the one tonight, to basically open up a space for leaders to grapple with the big questions of life and to come to not only ask better questions, but to better get to know the author of the answers. With each new evening conversation, we wrestle with one of those big questions, and certainly how we as Christians should think about not only the practice of our faith, but its implications for public engagement certainly qualifies as one of those. For decades, arguably the dominant, or at least one of the most vocal and visible modes of Christian public engagement was political, where various organizations mobilized values voters to fight culture wars and elect leaders who shared a similar worldview. But despite many electoral victories, there is a growing sense that an overtly political emphasis has not only failed, but potentially backfired, leaving widespread resentment for, in some cases, a strident tone or heavy-handed tactics, as well as questionable judgment on the part of those who claim to speak for the faith. There have been new challenges to Orthodox Christian practice as well, and a sense of cultural ground loss. Our keynote speaker tonight takes this even further, arguing that not only are the external threats to Christian practice much greater for Protestants, Catholics, and the Orthodox alike, but Christians themselves have largely accommodated themselves to an increasingly secular culture. He insists that what we need is a very different kind of strategy, one that involves what he calls, quote, embracing a limited withdrawal from the world in order to more effectively show the love of God into it. In his view, rather than wasting energy and resources fighting unwinnable political battles, we should instead work on building communities, institutions, and networks of resistance that, in his words, can outwit, outlast, and eventually overcome the occupation, as well as give greater emphasis to discipleship, without which, he argues, the collapse of Christian belief and practice in the United States is increasingly likely. It is a thought-provoking, dramatic, even controversial argument, which has helped to catalyze what is sure to be a rich and fascinating discussion tonight. How do we live faithfully in troubled times? Should Christians be rethinking our ways and means of engaging in the public square? How do we show the love of God into the world, befriending our neighbors without becoming assimilated ourselves, losing the saltiness of our faith? Tonight, we'll grapple with the wisest means of Christian public engagement in the midst of significant political as well as cultural shifts, as well as the new internal challenges to orthodoxy and vibrancy of the historic Christian faith. These are all big topics and deep questions, and I'm delighted to say that it is hard to imagine three individuals who have wrestled with them with more energy, conviction, biblical scholarship, or wisdom than our three speakers tonight. Starting us off as the keynote speaker will be Rod Dreher. Rod serves as the senior editor of the American Conservative, and he is one of perhaps the most prolific writers and bloggers I have ever encountered. He writes like I read, whose articles has appeared in so many numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, First Things, Touchstone, the LA Times, the Weekly Standard, and many others. You may also have recently seen a very interesting, even provocative profile of him in The New Yorker. He blogs at BeliefNet as well as the American Conservative. He appears on NPR's All Things Considered and BBC Radio. He is the author of the colorfully, if not concisely titled, Crunchy Cons: How Birkenstock Burkeans, Gun-Loving Organic Gardeners, Evangelical Free-Range Farmers, Hip Homeschooling Mamas, Right-wing nature lovers, and their diverse tribe of countercultural conservatives plan to save America, or at least the Republican Party. I'm not sure how he fit the title on the front of the book, but he did. He also wrote The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming and How Dante Can Save Your Life, which, I'll note, he will be discussing tomorrow night at the same time at Montgomery Bell Academy, and we would love to have you join us for that as well. His latest work, The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian World, which we've invited him to discuss here tonight, has already prompted or provoked a remarkable number of reviews, reactions, dissents, and cheers, leading one reviewer to call it, quote, already the most discussed and important religious book of the decade. Responding to Rod will be Dr. Russell Moore and Sister Mary Madeline Todd. Dr. Moore is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, or ERLC, of the Southern Baptist Convention, the moral and public policy agency of the nation's largest Protestant denomination. Prior to his election, just 4 years ago, Moore served as provost and dean of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he taught widely on both theology and on ethics. He's also the author of several books, seems to be a trend among our speakers, including Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel, Tempted and Tried, The Temptation and Triumph of Christ, and Adopted for Life, The Priority of Adoption for Christian Churches and Families. He also hosts Signpost, a weekly podcast on gospel and culture, and blogs at More to the Point. Sister Mary Madeline Todd has entered the Congregation of Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia in 1991 and serves as the Assistant Professor of Theology at Aquinas College here in Nashville. She earned her master's in theology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, another MA in English at the University of Memphis, and her doctorate at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. She is a regular member of the Catholic Women's Forum on Ethics at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and has contributed to the English, Italian, and French editions of the Vatican newspaper, I'm going to mangle this, L'Osservatorio Romano. Her published writings include contributions to the delightfully named books Promise and Challenge and Beautiful Mercy. Immediately after Rod's remarks, we will hear from both Russell and from Sister Mary Madeline. At the conclusion of their responses, we'll have a short moderated conversation between the four of us up front, and then we'll turn it over to you for the most dynamic part of the evening, questions from the audience. Rod, welcome.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Cherie, and it's such a pleasure to be here. It's really kind of a cool moment for me to finally meet some Nashville Dominicans, because they're the rock stars of the Catholic Church now. It used to be the Jesuits, now it's the Nashville Dominicans. One of the things I love about the Nashville Dominicans is they have what I also see that the Benedictine monks of Norcia have, a joyful orthodoxy. They show that being faithful to the teachings of the Church is not something that should make you sad. It's a liberation. So thank you so much for your witness. And I want everybody here to think for a minute about the images we've seen in the past week from Houston of floodwater covering the roads, houses, and familiar landmarks, and of settled lives turned upside down virtually overnight. People in Houston knew that a storm was coming, but they could not have imagined that it would be as bad as it was. There was nothing in history to compare to Harvey. Places that never before flooded went underwater. I know that feeling well. A year ago in Baton Rouge, where I live, a freak summer storm sat on top of our region for 3 days and dumped an unprecedented amount of water on top of us. As in Houston, places that had never seen flooding sunk below the muddy waters. The good news for Baton Rouge and for Houston is that the water eventually went down. People in Baton Rouge were able to rebuild somehow, and we're still rebuilding. And Houston will do the same. But what if the floodwater never receded? What if all the familiar landmarks that taught you where you were and even who you were had disappeared beneath the water, and you had no way of knowing when or if the flood was going away, or what you would find left when it did? That's how we Christians should think about the predicament we find ourselves in today. It's hard for us to understand this for the same reason it's hard for a fish to understand that he lives in water. But follow me for a second. We live in a time that Zygmunt Bauman, a famous sociologist, calls liquid modernity. What does he mean by that? Well, historians argue over when the modern period began, but all of them agree that by the time of the 18th century Enlightenment and the subsequent Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, modernity had definitely begun. Modernity was and is something unprecedented in human experience. Above all, it is a time of rapid change. Professor Bauman says that solid modernity was the first phase of this historical phenomenon. In solid modernity, things changed quickly at a pace never before seen in history. Kings were replaced by parliaments, farmers flooded out of the countryside into the cities to work in the new factories and so forth. But the change happened slowly enough for people to absorb them. But the rate of change accelerated as technology grew and as there was more and more chaos in society. And it eventually became so rapid that solid modernity gave way to liquid modernity. Liquid modernity, according to Bauman, is a condition in which change happens so fast that new forms, new institutions, and new customs do not have time to solidify before they change again. Liquid modernity is like a catastrophic flood that is washing away everything that we have known and has been doing so for some time. Most of us in this room are old enough to appreciate how unbelievably fast things have changed in just the past 2 or 3 decades. Marriage and gender most recently. Most young people, though, can't grasp it through no fault of their own. They were born into liquid modernity and at a really rapid pace. It's normal for them. Not all of these changes are bad either, certainly, but not all of them are good. The point I want to make today is that barring some unforeseen catastrophe, constant and accelerating change is likely to be a permanent condition in the West for generations to come. Now, Zygmunt Bauman says that people who want to thrive in liquid modernity have to become the sort of person that's not tied down by commitments. Everything has to be negotiable. You have to be able to go with the flow wherever the current takes you. Don't commit to a place, don't commit permanently to a spouse, don't commit to your friends, and don't commit to a religion. Anything that ties you down may keep you from succeeding and finding happiness. Life should be experimental. Well, the problem with this is that nobody really wants to live this way. We might think we do, especially when we're young. But what most of us want most of all is to find a solid, stable place to make our stand with our spouses, our kids, and our home and our communities. That's the only way humans can thrive. Constant chaos generates constant stress and anxiety, and ultimately, this becomes a failure to thrive. The great challenge of the lives of the younger generations now will be to seek and to find stability, and when they find it, to try to maintain it in a world of radical uncertainty. What does this have to do with the Christian faith? Christianity has absolutely not been immune to the ravages of liquid modernity. In fact, I would say the West, including the United States, has become post-Christian. That's shocking to some people. What do you mean by post-Christian? We go to a Christian school, there are churches everywhere. Most people believe in God. These things are true, but I believe they're a facade masking an edifice that's rotting. Christian Smith, a sociologist of religion at Notre Dame, has been leading a project for a long time studying the faith commitments of younger Americans. He has found that relatively few young American adults believe in the truth claims of historic biblical Christianity. They speak the language of Christianity and they use its concepts, but deep down, they have abandoned the faith. Instead, they believe in a mushy, generic pseudo-religion that he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. MTD has 5 basic tenets. God exists and watches over life on earth. Second, God wants people to be nice and fair to others. Third, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about yourself. Fourth, God doesn't really need to be involved in your life until something goes wrong or you need him to help you. And 5, good people go to heaven when they die, and most people are good people. Now, most of these things are true to a certain extent. God does exist, and he wants us to be happy, but that's not Christianity. This is not the religion that has been handed down to us from generation to generation across the centuries and across the oceans. There's no repentance here. There's no sacrifice. There's no prophetic sense. There's no way to deal with suffering in that. And it should not surprise us at all that that a society that's been taken over by moralistic therapeutic deism is one in which Christianity is disappearing. And it is disappearing. In the United States, we've thought ourselves to be immune from the secularization that has overtaken Europe in the 20th century and 21st century, and we have been for a while. We are much more religiously engaged than Europeans are. But a couple of years ago, a very important research paper came out from 2 of the leading sociologists of religion who said that finally the United States has definitively joined the religious decline that we've seen in Europe and in Canada and in Australia. The millennial generation especially is falling away from the faith at spectacular numbers, and we are going down that same path, and there doesn't seem to be any countervailing force to slow it down or stop it. I understood or got a glimpse of what this meant earlier this spring. I went to speak about the Benedict option at an evangelical college, conservative evangelical college, and I talked about the importance of practices in the Christian life. During the Q&A, an undergraduate stood up in the back and said, "I don't understand why you say practices are important to the Christian faith. Why isn't it enough just to love Jesus with all our hearts like we were taught growing up?" And I told her, well, we have to love Jesus with all our hearts, but that's not the end of things. You know, that love has to be embodied, and the Bible tells us what love means and how we should embody that in our communities and so forth, and we have to think about this. The young woman didn't understand what I was talking about. After the talk, one of the professors said, "You know what that young woman said? That's how 99% of our students are. Everyone comes here professing Christianity, but they come out of a shallow youth group Christianity where their faith is all about feeling. And so when the world comes to them and says, your faith is really mean on this or that point, they collapse because they've been given nothing." That's not on these kids. That's on my generation and my parents' generation. Benedict XVI likened what's happening now in the West to the fall of the Roman Empire. And I think he's right about that. You know, he said the spiritual desolation that we're feeling now is something that hasn't been seen in the West since Rome collapsed in 476. I think he's right, and I think that go along to get along Christianity is not going to survive this collapse in this time of testing. Christians have Jesus' promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church, but Jesus did not promise that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church in the United States of America. The fact is that so many of us for generations have taken the Christian faith for granted, assuming it would always be there, has a lot to do with why the church, Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox, is in so much trouble today. Now, I can't stand happy, clappy, fake optimism, so I'm going to be level with you. I'm going to level with you. Christianity is very sick in our country, and it may be dying. But I also have to level with you in a positive way. There really is hope. Our civilization has been in a place like this before, and God did not leave his people without help. In the year 476, when the Christian faith was still relatively young in Western Europe, the Roman Empire fell to the barbarians. A few years later, a man named Benedict was born in a town called Nursia in the mountains of central Italy. He was a Christian. His parents sent him down to the city of Rome in the year 500 to complete his education. And what he saw there shocked him, it disgusted him, and it made him rethink his entire life. It was just the chaos and the immorality and the decadence all around him. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. So he left the city, and he went into the forest to live in a cave and to pray and to fast for 3 years, seeking God's will. When he emerged, he began to lead groups of men who wanted to live in Christian community as monks. He wrote a kind of crude constitution to govern their communities, which we call today the Rule of St. Benedict. Now, all Benedict wanted to do was to figure out how to serve God in community in the ruins of empire. He didn't want to save the empire, it was already gone. When he died in the year 547, his little project had left behind 12, 13 monasteries in Italy. But then a really interesting thing happened. Men began flocking to the monastic movement, and also women. His sister Scholastica founded the Benedictine order of nuns. Monks who followed the rule of St. Benedict spread out throughout barbarian-controlled Western Europe. They built monasteries, they evangelized, they worshiped, they taught. Slowly, 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 over the decades and centuries, they began to re-civilize the place, and they laid ultimately the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization. Things might have gone very different for all of us had that young Christian man named Benedict not stepped out in faith, and had not tens of thousands of other young men done the same. Today, if you go to Benedict's hometown, Nursia, called Norcia, you can, in modern Italian, you can find a group of Benedictine monks who are still worshiping and praying in a monastery. I visited them a year ago to ask them about their lives and what we who live in the world and who may not be Roman Catholic can learn from them about how to build a faith that endures hardship. They've been at it for 1,500 years, they know. Well, I'll talk about all this in detail in my book, The Benedict Option, but basically here's what they told me. They said that our entire lives, everything we do has to be centered on God. We can't compartmentalize our faith. That won't work. Secondly, faith cannot merely be what we believe in our heads. It has to be made incarnate in the structure of our regular disciplines of prayer, fasting, of worship, of the structures we build around us and in our communities. And yes, you need to be embedded in a stable community of obligation. Fourth, you have to have walls of some sort separating you from the world. The Benedictines are famous for hospitality. They are told by the saint in his rule to welcome anyone who comes to the monastery as if that person were Christ himself. In our way in the world, we have to do the same. But the monks say that we have to be able to retreat behind walls, figurative walls to a certain extent, to build ourselves up in the faith and to thicken our connection to God and to each other. Or because if we don't do that, if we leave the gates wide open, we're going to be assimilated out of existence. Well, what does these basic principles mean for us? And what do I mean by the Benedict option? Do I mean that we all have to become monks or nuns? Absolutely not. But if you're called to that, I say embrace that vocation, embrace that calling. But I do mean that all of us Christians need to regard ourselves and to live in radically countercultural ways. And we need to establish the institutions or build the institutions we do have, build them up, and establish practices that will disciple us in the Christian tradition. It is about withdrawing to a certain extent from the world, not to hide from the world, but to go deeper into the prayer and worship traditions of the historical church and to bind ourselves closer to Christ and to each other. So when we go out into the world, we can be faithful witnesses to Christ. If we don't do this, we're not going to make it. The Benedict option, you might say, is about building a fleet of arks capable of riding out liquid modernity. I think, to switch the metaphor, faithful Christians should see ourselves as like the Hebrew exiles in Babylon. God allowed his people to be carried off into captivity in Babylon because he had a plan for them there. In Jeremiah 29, as we all know, the Lord told them to settle in the city, to take wives, to pray for the peace and prosperity of the city. I believe that we Christians have to do the same thing right here where God has us. So any talk that I'm saying we ought to all head for the hills, it's not true. We're called to be right here and bearing witness to Christ. But the book of Daniel tells us that there were 3 Hebrew exiles, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were such a part of Babylonian society, they even worked for the king. But when the day came that the king commanded them to worship an idol, they refused, even though it led them to a death sentence. Even as we live in our American Babylon, we had better be living in our families, and our churches, and our Christian schools and communities in such a way as to build up character like those 3 faithful Hebrew men, because we're going to be put to the test one day. Maybe not as severely as they have been, but in smaller ways we will be put to the test. Nobody is going to escape it. There is no safe place left in the world to be a Christian. We have entered, I believe, a period of great testing for the churches. Jesus told us this would come. And so, by the way, did Pope Benedict XVI. In 1969, when he was just Father Ratzinger, he predicted that in the years to come, the church would go through a purgation. She would lose her worldly power. People would fall away in droves, and practicing the faith would become more difficult. Only a relatively small number of truly committed believers would be left, but they would be living in peace and in joy and in love, the peace which passeth all understanding. They would be the light of Christ in a very dark world. Eventually, by God's grace, the lost world would rediscover the truth and beauty of what it had left behind through their faithful witness. Don't be surprised by what's coming. If you are, the fault is your own. The floodwaters are rising all around us. You can't sit back and wait for pastors and politicians and principals or anybody else to save you. It's time for all of us Christians to reflect soberly and realistically on our situation, and then to act to prepare ourselves and our families and our communities. In my book, The Benedict Option, I discuss different things that might look like. But I want to end with a true story of hope. Last August of 2016, in Norcia, there was an earthquake, and the earthquake shook the town, and it left cracks in the monastery there and in the basilica, the medieval basilica there where the monks were. They didn't stay there. They could see those cracks and said, it's kind of dangerous to be here. We might have more earthquakes. So they picked up and moved to tents outside the town to be safer. And because they could read the signs of the times, so to speak, and they got up and moved, they still ministered to the town, but they wanted to be out to where it was a little safer. They weren't at morning prayer when the big one hit on October 30th. The big one destroyed their entire basilica and would have killed them all at prayer had they been there, and it destroyed their monastery. Because they moved, they are alive today to help the town rebuild and to witness its resurrection and to help in that resurrection if that's what the Lord wills. They say that they look at the ruins of their church and say, this is Western Christianity today, and we want to do what God calls us all as Benedictines to do, and be there for the rebuilding. But they can be there because they had enough wisdom to back away before it was too late. So I want to thank you very much, and I hope we can get more into details after my colleagues speak, because there's a lot to discuss here. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, Rod, for that, as always, brilliant presentation today. I think it's very illuminating for all of us. And I'm really glad that we're here in my adopted hometown of Nashville, the Music City, home of so much in the music industry. Because when I think of many of the issues that we're talking about tonight, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is a genre called outlaw country music, which originated here in a group of people fleeing from Nashville and from the industry, because there was a time when the country music genre became so successful that the music industry assumed if we're going to grow, the way that we're going to grow is by continuing to sound something like what people like and something like what our audience likes right now. They didn't really have time for people like Chris Christopherson writing songs about Voltaire's Candide and really intellectual sorts of songs, or people who were dealing with really gritty matters that didn't really fit with the market-based industry standards. And so people along the lines of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson and others went to Texas, where they wrote whatever they wanted to, and said, we felt almost as though we were sending out messages in a bottle from an island, And before long, it started to resonate. And before long, ultimately, the music industry here welcomed at least some of them back into the fold. Now, the reason that resonates with me is because there was a time when that industry, as it was, seemed as though it were successful, but was on its way to succeeding itself to death. If there had not been a healthy voice of dissent within the industry would have died. And I think in many ways, in American culture, we're facing a very similar dynamic. There is a sense of complacency within the church that is combined with a sense of apocalyptic pessimism at the same time. Watch evangelical Christian television, and you can see in one moment a television evangelist talking about God's wonderful destiny for your life and your best life now. And then you, at another moment, can see a televangelist selling freeze-dried lima beans for the shelters that you'll need after the grid goes down. Sometimes it's even the same guy doing both of those things at the same time. This is not a healthy place for us to be in American Christianity. When people ask me, and they often do, what I think of the Benedict option, I have learned to say, what is the Benedict option to you? And the reason I do that is because it's the same sort of thing that I will do if someone says to me, are you a fundamentalist? In my world, I would not call myself a fundamentalist because most people would see that in terms of some very specific sets of doctrinal markers and cultural mores. But for some people in the secular world, when they mean fundamentalist, they mean, do you believe Jesus was raised from the dead? Do you believe that the Bible is true? And when that's the case, I say, yes, I do. When someone asks, what do you think of the Benedict option? And I say, well, what is the Benedict option to you? Someone who has never read the actual book or followed through will often say something along the lines of, do you think we should all head for the hills, as Rod said? Do you think that we should give up on American culture and on being salt and light in American culture? And of course, I don't believe that. I don't think Rod does either. But if what someone means by the Benedict option is a church that is intentionally focused on the cultivation of the church as a witness to the outside world, as the church engages the outside world, then yes, I think the Benedict option is indeed something worthy of considering. I told Rod earlier, I think that I would affirm everything that he affirms, except that I'm not as gloomy about the future of American culture as he tends to be. And it's a really good thing because I'm a Baptist preacher and I can't drink. So I don't want to get as gloomy as he is about American culture. Nonetheless, I think there is a sense in which the American church, in all of its manifestations, has a tendency to either downplay what is taking place in American culture in ways that assume if we just have a string of good elections, or if we just have a better social media strategy, or if we just have better praise and worship choruses in our churches, that we will turn this around in a way that is not true. And we have a sense of hand-wringing panic that somehow a golden age has been lost. I don't like the language of post-Christian America because I'm an evangelical Christian, and I think that much of what is called Christian America has been and is one birth short of the real thing. And so when Rod was speaking of moral therapeutic deism, he's exactly right. And I think that has, in many cases, replaced a kind of moralistic civic deism and several other manifestations of the same reality of what the old Presbyterian theologian called liberalism, not referring to the political designation, but to something that is other than Christianity, using Christianity as a means to an end. If the church is going to be able to navigate the sorts of waters that we're coming up against, I think some of the things that are going to be really important are going to be maintaining the distinctive personal character of Christianity along with the distinctive communal character of Christianity at the same time. The message that Christianity has of the personal is not necessarily American individualism. The scripture speaks individually and personally. You are the body of Christ, and all of you are members in it. And as Larry Hurtado, scholar of the first century, has demonstrated, one of the ways that Christianity was able to grow in a culture that was completely hostile to the most basic claims of the gospel was the fact that there was a distinctive and strange message of a God who loves, a God who personally is pursuing. We're in a culture right now that believes itself to be individualistic and yet is often caught in a herd mentality in which there are all sorts of sources of transcendence that people are finding and adopting, whether they're political arguments on Facebook, any number of things, that really aren't about the arguments themselves, as much as they're about tribal badges that will say, these are the people that I belong to, and these are the people that I do not belong to. That is a serious challenge to Christian witness. As one friend of mine put it, the major battle that we have in rearing up the next generation is not some of these really pressing moral and ethical issues. The major pressing issue that we have is, what does the next generation think of when they use the word we? Do they think first of a generational category? Do they think first of a national category? Do they think first of an ethnic category? Do they think first of a political category? Or do they think first of we as the global body of Christ on earth and in heaven? That is a challenge. And that means building the sorts of communities that are going to be able to understand that Christianity is not sola emotion or sola cerebra. We're not going to be able to turn this around simply by giving more bullet points of catechism or by having more meaningful experiences strung along for our children, but by actually bearing witness in communities that bear one another's burdens and are willing to bear the shame and reproach of Christ without growing resentful and angry, and continuing to be on mission with the kind of confidence that Jesus has throughout the New Testament, in which nothing, even to the point of trial before Pilate, seems to throw him off of the mission that he's undertaken. I think that the message that Rod has given of exile is a good metaphor. And I think often of Marilyn Robinson, the author in her book Lila, talks about a young woman who came out of a horrific, traumatic environment in which she'd had no connection with religion at all, who becomes a pastor's wife to an elderly pastor, and he finds her reading the Bible, but is disturbed that she's reading Ezekiel. He said, I love Ezekiel, but why would you start there? There are all sorts of scary images of wheels within wheels and so forth. And she said there was something about Ezekiel that resonated with her. And he gently explained to her, you're going to find a lot of really tough language that God's using against his people in Ezekiel. What you have to understand is that's because so much depended upon Israel. The life of the world depended upon an Israel that was holy. Same is true for the people of God right now. So if by a benedictoption we mean to reclaim what it means to be first the people of God, seeking first the kingdom of God, then I say 3 cheers for the benedictoption. Thank you.
First, I just want to thank Mr. Dreher for a book that is both thoughtful and thought-provoking. In the brief response that I'm able to give today, I can't state all the points I agree with, which are almost all. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm in any way trying to be opposed to his ideas, because I think this book should be read by all of us and thought through and prayed through. Because the question of how we live our faith in the world today is of the utmost importance. And truly, in the face of radical secularism, we are not going to be able to live a deeply Christian life by accident. We have to be intentional. We can't just go with the flow. You both said much about why we can't, and I agree. My first question, though, is whether Christianity is actually on the brink of death in the Northern Hemisphere. I know that we can all read many studies with many statistics, but I've never found statistics a really reliable measure of social well-being, and least of all of religious faith. My years of teaching in the classroom, working for International World Youth Days for several popes, and offering retreats for people of all ages has given me a vast experience of people hungry to encounter God, of people who are hungry for a teaching that can set us free. In the book, it's mentioned that there's a multiplicity of churches in the United States, but fewer and fewer people who I self-identify as religion, and I think the two go together. I think if we say religion is just a self-created, feel-good kind of experience, fewer people want that. And I don't think the young people of today flee from a high standard. I think they want a high standard. There's a section in the book that deals with that, and I think where we water down Christianity or make it all about our emotional experiences, we actually are not feeding the people of God the real gospel, the real encounter with Jesus Christ. The account in the book of the historical roots of the present crisis of faith in the West included, in my opinion, a very astute assessment of the interior decline that underlies the external symptoms we see. Much of our media, much of our attention is absorbed in the problems of our society, but sometimes we fail to look at the spiritual root. And this quote was from the book. "The long journey from the medieval world racked with suffering, but pregnant with meaning." This is the characterization of the Middle Ages. "Racked by suffering, but pregnant with meaning, has delivered us to a place of once unimaginable comfort, but emptied of significance and connection." That line just caught my attention. We are so comfortable, but we are so ill at ease. We have everything, but we're connected to no one. Meaning and connection. This is a twofold loss that underlies the later assertion that technology and sexuality are key challenges to recovering a hope amidst our liquid modernity. That the Benedictines were chosen as a model response to a world in crisis is both reasonable and beautiful. Saint Benedict responded to the crises of his day creatively by grace. I do believe that if we are walking in the grace of the Lord, we will be more creative, not less. Virtue is not about being stuck. It's about being fruitful, creative. Okay. The balanced, well-ordered life of prayer and work in the context of a stable community was and is an antidote to the chaos and disorder of any age, a disorder that leads to isolation. The Benedictine model of flight from the world was not merely reactionary. It was a response to a divine invitation, a way to embrace a troubled world and immerse it in the mercy of God through an intense life of prayer and through extending mercy through hospitality. Regarding the application of the Benedictine tradition to the life of the Christian in the world today, it is unquestionable that withdrawal from noise and busyness is necessary to be grounded in prayer and formed by the Word of God. Examples given in the book of intentional faith-based communities as networks of support reflect the reality that as humans we are social beings, that we receive and give in community with others. I was intrigued by the choice of the term domestic monastery for families today. whereas in many church documents, the family is referred to as the domestic church. The monastery is a place for formation of the monk, the one who is called to face God one-on-one. The church, originally a word from the Greek ekklesia, which was a place of gathering, is the place where believers are called to be united in Christ, members of one body. In the Pauline theology of the body of Christ, the stronger members are called to support weaker members, not cut them off. There is a great danger, and not one that I'm saying the book necessarily endorses, but I think some are interpreting it this way, in an exclusivist approach to Christianity, since spiritual pride is far more deadly to truly Christian charity than witnessing the weakness of one who is struggling morally. Education is, as presented in the book, essential to preserving links to the faith and to our past. I could not agree more that we are wasting our time and resources if we run schools that are secular materialist with only a superficial veneer of faith. If the gospel is not the guiding principle of all we do and teach, our schools are not Christian. There is no neutral ground in education. What we believe about the human person, about human happiness and flourishing, and about our ultimate destiny shapes every lesson and every interaction in our schools. Parents, as the primary educators of their children, must prayerfully discern not simply a path to a well-paid profession, but a foundation for holiness. If only one chapter of the book were read, I would recommend the one on technology. The many social problems we face are only symptoms of the real crisis of the human heart. The human person was made to love and to be loved. We were created to someday see God face to face. The tools of technology are not good or evil in themselves, but we do need to limit when, where, and how we use them, the so-called technological fast endorsed in the book. Saint Teresa of Calcutta rightly said that the poverty of the West is not material, it is spiritual. It is the profound loneliness of we who have so much and yet share so little. We must rediscover what Saint Benedict and all the saints understood, that experiencing the real presence of God in prayer, especially in the Eucharist, enables us to share the love we first receive in true communion. In the example frequently mentioned in the book of Marco Sommerini, it is noteworthy that Pier Giorgio Frassati was the inspiration for this group. Pier Giorgio, a young man of intense prayer and active political and social engagement, was a member of the Dominican laity. Some centuries after Saint Benedict formulated his rule, the church perceived the need for consecrated religious who would live the monastic framework as the basis of a dynamic outreach to a suffering world. Saints Francis and Dominic discerned the Spirit's call to a life formed in the silence, prayer, and simplicity of the cloister, of the monastery, that would bear fruit in an apostolate of witness and preaching. For the baptized Christian, it is necessary to safeguard and nourish the life of faith, especially by prayer and sacramental grace, but it is also to live the missionary call, to be the salt of the earth, to be the light of the world amidst an insipid culture and the darkness which has never overcome the true light. The very title of the book of the Benedict option is, I believe, important. Each of the saints and movements in Christian history was a gift of the Spirit for a particular need of the church in a particular time. It is true that humanity in the West today needs to be reawakened to the meaning of our existence and the real connections we all desire. Benedict's wise and balanced way of life is one option, as is the evangelical outreach of Francis, Dominic, and the missionary zeal of Ignatius. We will not be all called to the same option, but we will be called to the same goal: union with Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If in him we live and move and have our being, we will discover the option that renews each one of us from within and therefore renews the society to which we belong. Thank you.
All right, well, we will jump in with a point that I think each of our discussants made, which is a point that you brought up, Rod, which seemed fairly central to at least the first part of your book, and that is the idea that we're really at a unique time in at least American history where Christianity itself is threatened in America. And I'm reminded of the more hopeful take by G.K. Chesterton, who said that for the last 500 years, they've said that Christianity is going to the dogs, and each time it's the dogs who died. You talk about moralistic therapeutic deism, but of course, every era has had its own, perhaps unique heresies and characteristic sins. We don't have to go far back in this country to think about slavery and segregation, which denied the humanity of a good chunk of people. So starting with you, Rod, if you could clarify what it is about the tendency towards moralistic therapeutic deism that you believe lends it a particular poisonous potency. And then Russell and Sister Mary Madeline, if you could also comment on whether you believe we're in a particularly important time. Is there something unique about the sins of our age that threatens the future of the Christian faith?
That's a great question. And I would say that there was never a golden age. You know, each age has been characterized by sin and brokenness. It's a human condition. I think in particular about how a lot of conservative Christians in this country look back to the time before the 1960s as that golden age. Russell and I, as people of the Deep South, men of the Deep South, in the same generation, we can look back to that time and see at the time when the white church was completely silent on the racism and the injustice inflicted on African Americans. So that's not any kind of a golden age we want to go back to. But I think what characterizes this particular age is so dangerous is if you think back to what Martin Luther King, the prophetic witness he and the civil rights movement made to American society, they stood on the Bible, they stood on Scripture, they stood on that sense of right and wrong that was the heritage of our nation, our Christian heritage. I wonder today if an MLK would be possible, because we have taken this, we have allowed prophetic Christianity to go to pieces into this moralistic therapeutic deism, where it's very hard to talk to people about right and wrong when they believe that right and wrong is decided by what's right for them. This is where the philosopher Alistair McIntyre, I write about this in the book, he said this is what's characteristic of our time now, something he called emotivism, where it's hard to make arguments because everybody's all about feelings, and you can't argue with someone's feelings. I think McIntyre himself was prophetic in talking. I think he wrote that in like 1981. And we see the tribalism that we have got to in this country, where everybody's worried about triggering somebody else. They're gonna, we can't really make moral arguments anymore. It's very hard to. So I think that is what is particularly dangerous about our time today, that we don't have that shared sense of, even a basic sense of Christianity, of a shared sense of meaning that binds us together and by which we can judge our own actions and those around us.
I'm thinking of the comment you made, Russell, about what do people today mean when we say we? And I think for myself, if there is a reason why I see us in a particular crisis at this moment, what is the problem? Is that we have, with our technology, we have the illusion of more connection than ever. We have this illusion of hundreds of friends on Facebook. We have this illusion of I can be in touch all the time. That is hiding and masking a greater disconnect than ever. I mean, I think it's very interesting that whole families can be together and everyone looking at a screen and no one looking at each other. And I personally believe that the revelation of a God who loves us, a personal God, is the central reality that Jesus Christ came into this world to reveal, and that we as human beings mediate presence to one another. So I do believe that the misuse of technology, that can be even amongst very good people, is actually causing a threat to the society as a whole. I mean, most of us in this room didn't grow up with cell phones from the time we were toddlers, okay? But now we're raising a generation of people who, from the time they were little, spend more time looking at a screen than looking into human eyes. And the loneliness and the questions of this generation are profound, but there's also a rich opportunity there. Where human beings connect with each other, I actually think we have the opportunity to evangelize at a whole new level. But it's not going to be necessarily big, huge movements. It's going to be person to person. Well, the way Jesus led people to himself, come and see. Be part of a Christian community. So that smallness of the focus of the intentional community, I think, is going to be really important at this moment. And a real opportunity, even though it's also a threat in some ways.
I couldn't agree more with Sister Mary Magdalene. And on the issue of loneliness, I think that's really at the core here, because I don't see American culture moving from a Christian culture, at least as the New Testament would define Christian, into a post-Christian culture, as much as moving from a nominally, culturally defined Christianity that nonetheless had a sense of community. So when I say that cultural nominal Christianity is falling, and am critical of cultural nominal Christianity, that is by no means to say that everything there was bad. There were people who, with the sense of obligation of attending a church, did hear the gospel and become faithful followers of Jesus Christ. But I think more of what has happened culturally is that the dynamic that would have existed in, say, the 1920s, in which a couple in Nashville, Tennessee, who were having trouble in their marriage, probably would not have divorced. Why? I'm not sure that it is so much because they were more sanctified than Christians today. I'm not sure it's because they were more biblically educated, although they may well have been, but because in order to divorce, they would have had to consciously take a step away from their communities, a community that was defined in many places, most places in American culture by the church. That has gone, and there is nothing that is replacing that. And so I was chastened by the word of a fellow evangelical minister who was talking about the low rates of divorce among evangelical clergy as compared to everyone else, when there really weren't that dramatically lower rates of evangelical clergy having marital problems. And so what is the distinction here? It could be that the clergy are that much holier than the laity, but it could be that an evangelical electrician who divorces his wife isn't going to lose his job, his connections within the community that he has, where the clergyman has to say, this is going to bring upon me real costs. I think that is what has gone in most of American culture. And so there's an opportunity. I agree with Sister Mary Magdalene here, because there was a time where churches believed in order to connect with the outside culture, we do that by emphasizing what the outside culture already wants and needs. They don't care. They don't sit around wondering about the relationship of justification and sanctification in the book of Romans, but they do want to have healthy marriages and well-behaved children. And so many churches sort of targeted that as a kind of gateway into the gospel that in many instances sometimes eclipsed and replaced the gospel with a kind of behavioral modification. Now, increasingly, most places in this country, our neighbors don't care what our churches have to say about how to live a more successful life. Why would I listen to a clergyman about how to fulfill my destiny in my job when I have a life coach for that? That gives an opportunity for the church to actually reclaim what we have from the very beginning, which is the cross of Jesus Christ. And so I think there's a moment of opportunity here as well.
This is really a question for everyone, but Rod, one of the things you emphasize is the need for separation from the world in order to build more holy communities. But of course, one of the things we're called to is not just holiness, but also the love of one's neighbor. And the Gospels are full of stories of Jesus going out to minister to the least, last, and lost. And actually, his harshest words are reserved for the Pharisees, who took great pains to remain a distinct and, at least on the surface, holy community. So how do we balance the need for spiritual disciplines and communities to cultivate holiness with the other call to be salt and light, which is necessarily both a disinfectant and a preservative out in the world?
Well, I don't believe that we have the right as Christians to withdraw completely from the world. We have to show charity to our neighbor. It's mandated. But I think that we ever think about Christ's ministry. Before Jesus would preach to the crowds, he would withdraw into the desert to pray and be contemplative. I think in a similar way, we lay Christians have to make room in our own lives for quietness and contemplation. Not just literally, but to have a way to get away from the noise of the world and to be still and know who God is. And this can have really practical manifestations too. In my house, for example, we don't have a TV. Well, we do have a television set, but it's not connected to cable or anything like that. It's connected only to Amazon streaming and Netflix. My wife and I have made a point to curate what our kids watch. We typically watch it with them and discuss it with them. So my kids miss out on a lot of American pop culture, and I think that's a good thing. It's not though that we're putting them in a bubble where they don't understand what's happening at all. We talk to them about the news. My kids often want to watch the news clips with me. But we want our home to be like a domestic monastery in the sense that their mom and I have put up walls, symbolic walls, so behind which they can grow stronger as young men and young women, as Christians, to develop that internal strength so that when they go outside the wall, as they do when they go practice music or fencing or things like that, they know what it means to be a Christian. I think about the Ticolosi, this Catholic lay community in Italy that Sister talked about. Marco Semerini is their leader. They're very Orthodox, but they also they welcome the community, the broader community to come into their circles, to come to Mass with them, to come to Bible study, to come to sports, to do gardening, all sorts of things. But they know who they are. In fact, Marco's wife, Federica, told me, we have no problem, all of us in our community, going out into the world because we know who we are. We know whose we are. And they only know that because they pray together, they share meals together, they study the Bible together, they go to Mass together, and they do it. This is day in and day out. This is not any special thing. They think that is just how we're called to live as Christians. As it turns out, it's extraordinary. And it shouldn't be extraordinary. That's the Benedict option as I see it. It's just the church doing what we ought to have been doing all along, but we neglected because we fell into everything else.
Rod and I talk a lot whenever we're together about this phenomenon that we both have seen when it comes back to the question of children and technology. The sense of peer pressure that now is not a pressure upon the children, but a peer pressure upon the parents to make sure that their children are not out of step with the rest of the children in their particular context. And so most of the sorts of situations that have already been mentioned of children who are absorbed into screens or absorbed into uncurated pop culture is not because the children are somehow navigating this or even demanding this, but because the parents don't want to be seen as bad parents by not providing whatever it is that American culture can offer. When it comes to, Sharita, your question about how do we navigate this Pharisaical sense of holiness, my fear is there was a time early in my life when I knew a lot of Christians who marginalized other people because of their hyper-scrupulous commitment to personal holiness. I don't ever see that right now. I often see Christians who are angry and resentful of other people. But if you press it, it's usually not about holiness or even about Christianity, as much as it's about the same sort of resentments and divisions that would be present in the culture even if Jesus were still dead, that Christianity has taken a sort of place on the top of all of that as a hood ornament in order to resent your neighbor and give Jesus credit for that. That's what disturbs me right now. So I almost wish that I were having to have the conversation with more people. Your commitment to holiness is causing you to be walled off from your neighbors. I'm afraid that we see the worst of both worlds often, which is a situation just as carnal as the outside world, and yet also feeling at the same time spiritually superior to the outside world. And that's a deadly combination.
Sister Mary Madeline, anything to add?
It's hard for me to add. I think what Rod said is the kind of what I would hope parents would do. I mean, I think you can't block the entire world, because even if in your home you're having everything guarded, whatever, the second they walk out the door, they're encountering in the handheld technology of everybody next to them anything they want to look at. So I think you actually have to cultivate from within a sense of who we are, why we choose what we choose, why we do what we do. It's not just about filtering the world out there, although there are credentials that you take, but there's a formation of the spirit, and it's going to take families being really present to each other. Parents who explain to their child, why do we want to choose to look at certain things or talk about certain things? And if there's that engagement, then I think there is, Catherine of Siena was a Dominican laywoman in the time of the church, the 14th century. Italy was in total political turmoil. And she said something amazing about engagement. She spent 3 years just praying and praying and praying. And then the Lord sent her into an incredibly active, dynamic. She was a diplomat. She was talking to the Pope, talking to princes. But she said, you have to keep an interior cell, a room in your heart. A monastic cell, is the room that is simple and purified and has only what you need to be in communion with God. Okay? And she said, you have to keep that within, because the world around you has all these things happening. It's telling you all these things about who you are, some of which may be true and many of which may not be. But she said it's a two-chambered cell. She had this interesting image. She said, if you just enter into yourself in like total introspection, it's just thinking about yourself, you'll get discouraged. Because you'll say, look how hard the world is, look how bad I am, how weak I am. But she said it's a two-chambered cell. And the inner cell is where it's you with Christ, where you come to know yourself in Christ. And if a family's formed in solid reading, in good entertainment, in discussion of the things of the world, in a gospel-centered mentality, then you can know yourself in Christ. And regardless of what's going on out here, you can actually have this awareness of who you are and whose you are that gives you stability in the midst of the difficulties. And you know from within why you want to choose things. It's not just about rules and blocking. It's about, I choose what I choose because it's important to me. And I've seen young people who make very good choices because their parents formed them that way. Help them to become solid, not just forbidden, virtuous.
So there's so much more that could be asked, but we're going to turn to the most dynamic part of this evening conversation, which is questions from you all. Now, those of you who have been to a Trinity Forum evening conversation before know that we have just 3 guidelines for audience questions. We ask that all questions be brief, and especially tonight. I will also ask that answers be brief. Secondly, we ask that all questions be civil. And third, we ask that all questions be in the form of a question. So I'm actually going to moderate questions from up here at the podium, but we'll have Ken and Mary on either side with a microphone. Please wait for you to be called on and for you to have the microphone before answering the question, and we will go through a number of questions in rapid fire. So questions from the audience.
Hi, and thanks for your comments. I'm struck by much of Christian practice being defined as a negative ethic, in the sense that it's reaction to something as opposed to a positive affirmation of an ethic. And as I've read the book and read the blog, where do you characterize your thinking on that spectrum? Because I can sense both, but I think there's implications as to whether or not it's negative or positive in tone.
Right, well, that's one of the frustrating things that I find when I go out and meet people, spend any time with them, people I've never known before, somebody will inevitably say, oh, I thought you would be really gloomy, but I'm not that guy. And maybe that's because I come from South Louisiana, and we know when a hurricane is coming, oh, that's when it's time to get the gumbo pot out and ice the beer down, and let's rejoice together amid the disaster. That's my theory anyway. But I think that it's just really hard for me, just in my particular vocation as a writer about things in the news and culture, to write about good things, the things that give me joy. Because if I didn't have Christ, let me put it this way: Evelyn Waugh was once asked, how, you're a Christian, but you're such a nasty man. He said, my dear, if I didn't have Christ, you can't imagine how much nastier I would be. And I think there's something to that about myself, because I do go to church faithfully. I pray, I think, and I read, and I have so much joy in the Lord. But I think it's a real temptation for people like me who are involved in journalism to only point out the bad things, what we're running away from, and not what we're running towards. I think it's probably less of a temptation for my friends here, but let them answer.
I think some of it has to do with the sorts of questions that one is being asked perpetually. And so that's, I remember, I will sometimes have journalists who will call the first questions about sexuality, second questions about sexuality, third questions about sexuality, fourth questions about sexuality, fifth questions about sexuality. And then the journalist will say, why are evangelicals so obsessed with sex? And I'll have to say, that is true. And I'll say, I'm not obsessed with sex. You're obsessed with sex, and I didn't call you. And so I do think that there is a necessary job of exposing the sorts of assumptions that we have that aren't questioned, but that has to always be done with a priority of a gospel that is joyful and is in fact good news of the deliverance of captives and sight for the blind. And so that's, I think that's perpetually going to be a struggle for us to do.
I think you have to always look to, when Jesus summarized the entire moral life in 2 commands, what were they? Love God above all, love your neighbor as yourself. And that love of God and love of neighbor is the guiding point of all the ethic that does include negative prohibition. And I try to explain it to young people in the way that I try to explain it to older people. I said, on the human level, when you love another person, without anyone telling you, there are certain built-in commands. That if I love you, I'm not going to lie to you. Now you can say it positively, tell the truth. Or you can say it negatively, don't lie. But love knows. St. Augustine, the great patristic saint, said, love and do what you will. And people quote this all over the place. They think it means just, oh wow, I can do whatever I want. But what does it mean? It means if you really love, you can do what you will. Because if you really love, are you going to do any of the things God forbid? If you really love your spouse, are you going to be faithful or not? If you really love your children, are you going to raise them well? If you really love your parents, are you going to honor them and respect them? But interestingly, in salvation history, God revealed himself gradually. And in the earlier part of the giving of the law, he gave it in principally negative commands with a positive focus. And as they matured in the Spirit, when we look at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, instead of saying, do not commit adultery, he said, blessed are the pure of heart, for they will see God. Because by the grace of the Holy Spirit, we were supposed to be not leaving aside the commands of the old law, but fulfilling them through the grace of the Spirit. And so there is a kind of positive call to maturity that comes with a deepening of our Christian life. But it includes both. It never leaves behind one another. But I think it's all about love. But love is not some mushy, nebulous thing. Love is a very concrete, demanding thing.
Well, can I have a second just to follow up on that?
Just a second.
I remember when I first came to Christ, I was an adult. I came into the Roman Catholic Church, and I was totally sold out for Christ Catholic. And I remember as I was doing that, a woman at my office said, "Hey, I hear you're coming into the Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic. I volunteer at the Missionaries of Charity Soup Kitchen downtown. Why don't you come join me?" I said, "That sounds very Catholic. I think I'll do that." So I went there and I spent the days peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots. And after it was over, I said, "Well, that was nice, but really I'm more of an intellectual. My time would better be spent reading theology," and I never went back. So, and I was a very, very fervent Catholic, but for the next 13 years or so. And then I started writing about the abuse scandal. And nothing in my faith had prepared me for what the things I saw. And over the course of 3 years, I lost my Catholic faith. And I very nearly lost Christ himself. And I would say, looking back on that, I wish that instead of spending all my time just in my head as a Catholic, reading arguments, I'd spent as much time praying and peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots. And I wish I'd spent so much less time with my other conservative Catholic friends griping about what was wrong with the church, and instead focusing on what was right about the church. Because when the time of testing came, I did not have what I needed in my heart to withstand the suffering and the trial. I thought as long as I had it all in my head, my faith could withstand anything. But it's not true. And it's not true whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, I don't care what. You've got to be rooted in joy as well as prohibition.
That's right.
I suppose this is for Mr. Dreher primarily. I'm come from a non-creedal Christian tradition. I'm a graduate of a Tennessee Bible college. And one of the fruits of that is it valued being Christian over being conservative or liberal. So I would hope that the conversation gets drawn a little bit broader than traditions that aren't distinctly evangelical or Catholic or Orthodox. But related to drawing that more broadly, how would you respond to the new monasticism types of deals, Jonathan Wilson Hargrove, and some of those intentional communities that involve more of a sense of intentional community rather than fostering family within the faith? And related to that, are you really, the impression that I got from your book, and I think you made dissent from it in the book someplace, is that are you really calling just for a re-energized development of the 1920s fundamentalist reaction to modernism, where a subculture was developed that produced the Bible college that nurtured me in the faith? I suppose that's two questions, intentional Christian communities and the fundamentalist subculture of the 20s.
Okay, well, I didn't focus on the new monasticism movement among young Protestants for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted this book to be able to speak to single Christians and families, wherever they are, people who aren't going to have the ability to, or maybe the desire or calling to, live in a strictly intentional community like the new monastics. Secondly, it isn't my impression that they're particularly orthodox in their Christianity. I could be wrong about that. I wish them no ill. I wish them great success. It's an interesting experiment, but that's not one that most of us can do. And it's just too, I don't think we're called to necessarily to do that. Secondly, about the fundamentalism question, you know, this is one of the fascinating things I've learned in doing this, in talking about this book and writing about the book. I have had no experience at all of fundamentalism. I was raised in a Methodist church, but we weren't big churchgoers. I came to Christianity in a serious way as an adult, as a Roman Catholic, and now as an Eastern Orthodox Christian. So I was not prepared for the real pushback I get from some evangelicals who came out of fundamentalism. And when they hear me talking about the things I talk about in the book, they say, "Oh, that's fundamentalism," and they get really scared about it. And I don't understand what they're talking about. But as I've gotten to know certain evangelicals who've dealt with that, I understand more what they mean. And I would simply say that when I think about fundamentalist Christianity, I think of anger and fear. I get angry sometimes, but I'm not basically an angry person. I'm not a frightened person. I take joy and pleasure in family and friends and good food and feasting. We also fast. That's part of my tradition, feasting and fasting in season. And so I would say, insofar as I understand what the fundamentalists were doing, I'm not in favor of fundamentalism, but I think they did have something right in the sense that it's very hard to reconcile authentic Christianity with modernity as modernity has gone along. And so I think to the extent that they saw that there was something distinct about being a Christian and it couldn't really be completely harmonized with modernity, I think they were on to something. But maybe you can help me understand that better.
Well, I mean, part of the problem, as alluded to earlier, is fundamentalist means very different things. So the fundamentalist modernist controversy, the very beginnings of that, I think is a very healthy thing, because what you had were Orthodox Protestants who were saying, despite the liberalization of our denominations, we believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, the virgin birth of Christ, and these core fundamental doctrines that really was broadly cooperative, that then soon became something quite different, which many people have had the experience of a very narrow, sectarian, often rules-based sort of distinguishing of one another with really, really tertiary sorts of doctrinal boundaries. Part of that, I suspect, has to do with people who were, at the very beginning, essentially ejected from their communions, their denominational homes, with something that had become an entirely different sort of religion than what it had been founded with. And sometimes there can be a sense of self-definition of I am not those people that I came out of, that I think all of us are prone to.
We're a little bit over time, but we will take one last very short question. We'll ask for short responses from our three panelists. Is there a last questioner? Right there.
Short. Short. I'm involved in our state family policy council. We deal with life, marriage, religious liberty. And I think that what's different today is people in our society are actually trying to change what religious liberty is, what our freedom of religion is, even what our free speech is. And they're trying to shut us down from even being able to speak to as believers in our culture. My question is, in the political arena, how translate this for us? Because I follow Russell on Twitter, and I don't follow Rod, but a lot of people I follow you. And particularly during this last campaign, when we had two choices, both of you were pretty against our current president. And to me, it was a simple, it's a two-part question. Which one is going to give us religious liberty? Which one is going to give us Gorsuch on the Supreme Court? Which one is going to give us conservative judges?
One question.
So help us translate, because my sense is you all are opposed to supporting those kind of efforts when those are the very efforts that impact and help us one day overturn Roe v. Wade, one day overturn Obergefell.
Okay.
How do you square
All right.
those two things?
So we're going to ask for very short responses, and
Well, I mean, if I'm opposed to working in favor of life and family and religious liberty, then I'm very schizophrenic, because I'm spending 20 hours a day doing just that. So, Rod, what do you say?
Yeah, and I didn't vote in the presidential election because I'm from a red state and was going Trump anyway, and I was really, really torn. I think these are two horrible candidates. And I hope for the best out of the president we have now. But my argument has always been in this project is, religious liberty, if we preserve it, it has to be preserved for something. Politicians are not going to turn this thing around. We should be involved in politics, yes, and vote as intelligently as you can. But don't think that's going to be what turns things around. What's going to turn things around is what you do in your family, in your church, and in your local community. And the thing that I'm so concerned about with my fellow political and religious conservatives is we think that turning things around is a matter of thinking the right political thoughts, voting for the right candidate, and watching the right TV shows at night that tell us to be angry at the right people. You know, and to me, it's a facade. And it's not that politics are not important, it's that we make them too important when actually the real battle is in our churches and our families and in our local communities.
Sister Mary Madeline, final word.
This is really ironic that my final word is on politics. Anyway, my father asked me after the recent elections how I could be so unruffled at a time of such devastating things in our country. And I said to him, my hope has never been in being saved by the President of the United States. My hope is somewhere else. And I will pray daily for whomever we elect and all the people who serve. And I admire greatly those who are working for better public policy and better law. But my hope has never been there, and I know where my hope is. And he looked at me and he said, I finally get you.
Thank you to each of our panelists. That was terrific. We would highly commend Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, which is on sale outside for $25. I think you can probably convince Rod to sign it for you as well. Another invitation that we would commend to you is the one right before you on the desk to join the Trinity Forum Society. We hope that each of you will not leave here tonight before doing so. We at the Trinity Forum try to provide a space and resources for leaders to have the kind of reflection and kind of conversations about that which matters most. At a time when our culture is characterized by both divisiveness and deep distraction, carving out a time and space for deep reflection on first principles is one way that we try to help people with a renewing of their mind and focusing not only on what matters most, but also who matters most. We're really glad that you've joined us here tonight, and we hope that you will make this opportunity available to more people as well. In addition to that, as a special incentive, the first 10 people who join the Trinity Forum Society tonight will get a free signed copy of Rod's book. So you can avoid the line and just go straight to one of my colleagues to join. In addition to that, you'll be receiving our quarterly readings, where we take one of the best pieces in history of literature and letters, explain why it matters, its enduring significance, and the deep spiritual questions it raises. This includes excerpts from the Divine Comedy with an introduction by Rod, as well as many other titles ranging from Augustine, we're thinking about Aquinas in the future, to many other thinkers, and commend those to you. It's also appropriate, I think, at this time, as we conclude, to end with thanks. And there are many people to thank who helped make this evening happen. In particular, I'd like to thank our host, Sister Ann Catherine, the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia, and the faculty of staff. It was such a joy to work with you all, and we really appreciate all you did to make this evening special. We had a number of fantastic volunteers working behind the scenes: Tracy Wilson, Linda Hilliard, Kim Hoover, Kevin Kyle, and Mary Peters. Thank you to each of you. We'd also like to extend thanks to photographer John Morgan and videographer Brian Height. The photographs will be on Facebook. Again, we'll have them up within 24 hours, so please log on, tag your friends, share the word. And video will be available both on our website at www.ttf.org, as well as St. Cecilia's site. We also have heard that Brian will be creating a short highlight video, so you'll have to be sure to check that out. I'd also just like to thank my terrific colleagues who do so much behind the scenes to make this look seamless, to Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, and Ashley White. Thank you as well, once again, to Byron Smith, our trustee, really the mastermind behind this evening. And thank you to our panelists, Rod Dreher, Russell Moore, Sister Mary Madeline Todd, as well as to each of you for coming out tonight. Good night.